Well, thank you very much. It's a great crowd. There must have been food, some kind of, and it is chilly outside, so delighted to see the crowd. It's also a great pleasure for me to be back up here in Cambridge and MIT. I was privileged to spend a year in residence here back after I retired from the Navy, and really enjoyed it. Great to be back among you. So we've got a pretty interesting subject, and the really interesting thing is that you've got a very, very distinguished panel here of people with tremendous credentials in their professional fields, all of which are very broad and intersect in many aspects of our lives and society. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this subject of the individual that's pictured on the left and in the top center of this poster that Michelle has sent around to try to lure you in here. And so we have this challenge. The Snowden affair, as it's called, has certainly gotten a lot of media attention and a lot of opinions, pro, con, and every other way. I think it's exceedingly topical for a number of reasons. First of all, we are in a decidedly different world in the business of intelligence and national security than we were just a few years ago when I was on active duty, in that the leapfrogging advances in technology enable so many more things to occur at such blinding speed that it's, in my opinion, pretty much outstripped our ability to kind of keep track of it. And in the legal sense, we have a couple of doctors of law here who will probably have an opinion or two on this subject. But it's fast. The technology leaps have fast outpaced certainly the policy world and the ability to get a grip and understanding. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is the detail of the revelations that have come out. Some, I'm sure you've seen, are decried by our government leaders, many of them as exceedingly damaging and dangerous. And we probably have a few thoughts on this as well. Then there's the whole business of a government employee in the bowels of one of the most highly classified segments of our government, who somehow has managed to acquire an incredibly large amount of information and data, and then it's coming out in dribs and drabs through various sources. So there are people who feel very, very strongly about this subject, and I'm sure we have a couple in the audience that may have an opinion or two. So I don't think you need much more of a backgrounder to kick this off. The rules of the road are going to be that we will invite our panelists to have some minutes of offering about their thoughts, and we may have some discussion here amongst the panel, and then before the clock has rung the grand finale here, we'll open up to your questions. If you desire to have something to ask, please. We probably don't need too many statements, but if you have something to ask that might add to the dialogue, please feel free to come up and use the microphone. And you can position yourselves at whatever one seems handiest for you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. First, on my far left is Mr. Joel Brenner. He's a very well-known, highly respected attorney, and he's an expert on this curious mix of intelligence, cyber, and the law and policy through many years of experience, both in government and out. He received an education down the street here at some institution that is close to the Charles, but not quite on it. At Harvard, he has a Doctor of Laws degree, also got a PhD from the London School of Economics, en route to many years of government and now private sector service. He's one of the rare experts on a rather arcane body that inhabits Washington that I'll ask him to talk a little bit about. And it's the Committee for investment in the United States. He has been a prosecutor at the Justice Department in the Antitrust Division. He was the Inspector General of the National Security Agency. He was the senior counsel at the National Security Agency. And he's also was the head of counterintelligence for the Director of National Intelligence when that organization stood up here not too many years ago. So Joel, I am very, very pleased to welcome you here and to invite you to kick off our afternoon's discussion.
Thanks, Bill. Can everybody hear me? It's great to be back here at MIT, and hello especially to those people I can't see over there because of the way these tables are set. I'm going to not get off on the question of whether this guy is a saint or a villain. I want to talk about, because we all want to think that people who do things we particularly don't like or do like are all one or the other. And this is a very, very complex set of problems that this man has loosed upon us, including pushing us into some extremely good dialogue, which is, I'm going to explain to you in a minute, I believe the government itself should have stimulated years ago and has hurt us terribly. I want to point out at the beginning that we are in the midst of a very unusual, I think unique, intelligence affair. Previous intelligence scandals have involved a failure to warn, such as the failure to warn of the Pearl Harbor attack, or systematic abuses of legal authorities to spy on Americans, such as came out during the Church Pike hearings in 1976. We now have an intelligence agency that's being criticized for collecting too much foreign intelligence and for having collected metadata on American citizens, which, whatever you think of the merits of the program, were authorized by a Congress that did know what it was authorizing and that were subsequently approved by a series of federal judges. This is the first time we've had an intelligence scandal involving an agency that's done what it was legally authorized to do. Now, when I arrived at NSA as the Inspector General in 2002, I learned very quickly about what came to be known as the President's Surveillance Program or the Terrorist Surveillance Program that the New York Times broke and to the public in December of 2005. And when I learned of this, well before it was broken to the public, it seemed to me two things. One is that no president could have failed to authorize the collection of communications involving one person overseas who we knew was affiliated with bad people and somebody in the United States, and metadata in connection with that kind of collection. The question I asked was, why not do it under FISA? Because in 2002, the president could have got FISA amended in the blink of an eye. The true answer to that was that the administration at the time hated FISA. They were intent on proving that they had the power under Article 2 of the Constitution to do what they wanted in terms of this kind of telecommunications because it involved foreigners, whereas the Congress, of course, had the power under Article 1 to regulate international and foreign telecommunications. The answer that I got to my question from the intelligence professionals, though, high up, was that we would give up a certain tactical advantage by having a public debate that would be attendant on the attempt to revise FISA at the time, and that our enemies would have learned something from that public debate. To which I said, that's undoubtedly true, but the unity of the country behind the fundamental authorities of the intelligence business is a strategic goal. I mean, intelligence involves secret, powerful institutions in a political culture that is deeply hostile both to power and secrecy. The only way you square that circle is when the public understands what the broad rules are and has reason to believe they're being followed. So I said to people I won't name, it's as foolish in politics to subordinate tactical advantage to strategic issues as it is in military operations, and that's what you're doing. It wasn't my job to make that decision. And you know what eventually happened. After the business came out in the New York Times, the attendant publicity was vastly greater than would have attended a discussion of this in the Congress in 2002. The Obama administration now finds itself, it is perplexed to find itself in fundamentally the same position, notwithstanding the fact that what NSA did in terms of the metadata, which is mostly what the public has focused on, only on the metadata. Because the public had no notion of the pervasive collection of this data, and partly because of the way the information was broken, still has very little understanding of the fact that the rules by which NSA can consult this data are very strict and strictly enforced. And we have found ourselves now in a scandal that has produced public hostility and public both understanding and misunderstanding far greater than would have happened if we had released this information, as I believe we should have done. The government should have had this in 2008. This makes some of my colleagues still in the business really squirm when I say this. But I say to them what I said to clients when I was doing a trial practice. If you cannot avoid facts, you must embrace them. When the other guy drags them out of you, it always looks worse than it is. So put them out on your own terms. We are now living in an era of extraordinary transparency at every level of our lives. Personal, organizational, because our companies are losing trade secrets at a rapid clip, to espionage and other kinds of leaking, and at the governmental level, as we now see with this wholesale loss of terribly important information. Meanwhile, our collection against terrorist targets has gone like this. And if you tell the Russians, for example, that we are collecting their diplomatic communications, do you think they're surprised that we were trying? Do you think they don't do that to us? But when you tell them, if you tell them, oh, we are actually doing it to you, not just trying, that kind of operation can take 8 or 10 years to put into place. How long do you think it takes the Russians to shut it down? 20 minutes? An hour and a half? That's the kind of downside of this release, this massive release of information that we're having to deal with now. One of the issues that's come up, though, is this is no longer a domestic issue in the United States. We are now having issues with our allies that, and I want to say what I put it this way. Intelligence agencies are in the business of stealing secrets. That's what they do. There's no point sugarcoating it. They do it at the risk of being shot, hanged, or expelled from the countries they're working in. And all countries do it, political and the political military espionage. I'm not talking about commercial espionage, which we don't do. The Chinese do it, the Russians do it, we do not. The notion that one could break the laws of other nations with impunity is now being called into question in ways that really are going to challenge the intelligence business going forward like never before. We are hearing for example, the notion that there should be universal rights. We should treat everybody like we do Americans. You can dream about that if you want, but that's not going to ever be on the table. But we are, and there have been people suggesting, if you know the lingo, that we treat the Russians, the Germans and the French as members of the Five Eyes community. That's Britain, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. That's a non-starter too. But it is really time we stop wasting our resources collecting against the French and them against us. We need to get closer to the French and the Germans, and I believe that that is on its way. That's going to happen. Now, let me address, because there are so many issues, aspects of this that I can only touch on briefly in a few minutes, about some aspects of intelligence that I think the public hasn't quite understood. Big headline, NSA breaking BlackBerry encryption. Why? Why? Are we collecting against grandma? During the Cold War, and in all previous times, if NSA or its foreign counterpart wanted to collect against a foreign diplomat or general, it had to break encryption used by that military service or diplomatic service and by no one else, and totally unavailable in commercial circumstances. In fact, there was no commercial world east of the Iron Curtain. This was true in 1914. It was true in 1940. The governments of the world, including our own, have moved hard away from homegrown technology and homegrown encryption. President Obama uses a BlackBerry. It's a specially juiced BlackBerry, but it's a BlackBerry. Angela Merkel used to use a Nokia. Now she uses a BlackBerry. All the governments of the world have moved toward commercial, off-the-shelf hardware and software because no government, even our own, can possibly keep up with the extraordinary effusion of technology that comes out of our private sector. And they can't afford to try. That means if NSA or GCHQ or French or Russian intelligence want to collect against a foreign target, they have to be able to break the same encryption that you or I use. Not because they want to collect against grandma, but because they want to collect against somebody overseas who's using it. This makes the legal and policy world incredibly more complicated. But it is not a problem that was invented by the intelligence business. They didn't want this dilemma. It was thrust on them by the speed of the technology invention cycle. That's the world we're now in, though, and it is presenting really serious legal and policy issues. I want to come back real briefly to what I call a transparency revolution. The government has not come to grips any more than the public has with the extent to which, well, I won't say there are no more secrets anymore. I won't say we're in a totally post-secrecy, post-privacy world, but those exaggerations really do illuminate the world that we live in. Very few things will be secret anymore, and those things which are kept secret won't stay secret very long. The security business is still, and the security apparatus is still imprisoned in metaphors of locks and keys. Locks and keys in software are just another string of ones and zeros. The real goal in security now is to retard the degradation of the half-lives of secrets. Secrets are like isotopes. This is a real mind change that the security apparatchiks have barely begun to come to grips with and still believe they can keep things secret for a long time, which is why we did not see the government in 2008, when FISA was last amended, want a public discussion of this issue. They didn't realize they weren't going to be able to keep it secret anyway. Now, let me just close, because I got maybe a minute or two left, and talk about the international norms. Our diplomats are in for some very rough sledding as a result of what this character has done. We are now about to enter into serious negotiations over a transatlantic free trade zone. The consequences for prosperity on both sides of the ocean are enormous. The issues of privacy, on the other hand, must be kept out of this, or they will scuttle those conversations. But they will be raised in other forums, and our diplomats are going to have a very hard time dealing with it. The second thing is the most important issue most of you have never heard of, and it relates to something called the International Telecommunications Union, which it's a UN organization which up till now has had nothing to do with the role of controlling or regulating the internet as opposed to telephones and telegraphs. And if they get hold of it, if they get hold of internet governments and wrench it away from ICANN, we will see countries like China and Russia have an enormous amount to say about the re-sovereigning, that's to say, the governmental control of the internet. What is really peculiar and perverse and ironic is that the Snowden affair is being used around the world for saying you can't trust ICANN or anything having to do with the United States government. We need to put this in the UN. If it's put into the UN, you will see Chinese standards governing our equipment. You will say goodbye to Cisco and goodbye to Juniper. And we will watch the world really become Chinese in terms of something the public doesn't care about, doesn't understand, and that is the technical standards that govern how the internet works and the equipment that's used on it. We did a bad job of getting ready for the Dubai discussion of this, and I don't think we're doing a very good job of getting ready for the next round late next year, which is going to be in Korea. Watch this space, because it's a terribly important, unsexy issue that will have a lot to do with the future of the internet. And this guy has made that much harder for us.
Well, Joel, thanks very much for opening the discussion. You've raised a plethora of issues and insights into the reality of the complexity of today's technical intelligence environment, and we thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be some comments and questions. Our next panelist, seated to my immediate left, is a very renowned journalist and author, Susan Chira of the New York Times. She was also educated down the street here at another institution from which she distinguished herself in academic terms as a major in history and East Asian affairs, then went off to study Japanese in Tokyo and in beautiful Middlebury over in Vermont. And then she joined the New York Times back in 1981, just yesterday by my calculations, but she claims to have had a multi-decade career in this journalism business. She's had a number of positions with the Times over the years, including spending 5 years in Tokyo, putting her Japanese language skills to the test. She was the deputy foreign editor and then the foreign editor of the Times. She's diversified into things like the director of book development with the Times. And her current assignment is as the assistant managing editor for news, which she's held since 2011. We're really honored to have Susan with us here today, and invite Susan to have a couple of comments from your perspective on this subject.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm very honored to be on the same panel as people who really actually are far more expert in national security issues than I am. And my career has primarily been as a journalist and very involved with foreign affairs. But I did get a partial window on our experience publishing and trying to pore through some of the documents that Edward Snowden passed on As many of you know, the New York Times was not the kind of primary vector this time. Edward Snowden gave caches to The Guardian, of course, and to The Washington Post. And then subsequently, The Guardian approached the New York Times, partly because of The Guardian's concern about its legal peril in the UK. And as you may have seen, the editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, was questioned before Parliament in a rather hostile way because Britain's press protections are not as robust as those in the United States. So The Guardian shared some level of these documents with the New York Times. We do not have access to as extensive documentation as some of our competitors do, but of course, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how an institution like the Times weighs decisions to publish when there are questions of national security involved, and how we weigh the representations made to us by the government that disclosures would harm national security against our mission to inform the public. And I think, of course, the Times has been criticized both on the right and the left, whichever way it's come down in individual decisions. The Times does take these questions seriously. We don't have an absolutist sense that everything we learn must be published. And we try to assess it on a case-by-case basis, which weighs issues of our primary mission, which is to lay before the public whatever we can so that the public can decide and be better informed. And what I think has been so fascinating about the Snowden documents has been, as Joel described, it unleashed a debate that I think most people, even critics of the decision to publish, believe should have been aired and needed to be aired, and has prompted enormous reflection on what level of oversight is being conducted within the government about NSA activities. And of course, we all have to remember the context under which these programs were deepened and expanded post 9/11, driven by fear. As foreign editor, for 8 years, I certainly saw up close the legitimate concerns about terrorism and that prompted this. But what has been a fascinating revelation as these documents have been uncovered is that it's led to, I think, a robust and productive debate about to what extent are the FISA courts, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. This is the courts that were established under law to review the requests by the NSA to collect or disseminate or search through data, particularly insofar as it involves American citizens who have extra protections under our Constitution. And one of the issues that have come out that I think is still being discussed, that I think is an unabashedly productive issue, is to what extent the FISA courts have been sufficiently rigorous in holding the NSA to follow its own stated procedures. I think a lot of the disclosures, and I'm sure Joel will know more than I do about it, but I think it can be argued that, and in fact, some internal reviews by the government that have come to light have suggested that the NSA did not follow its own guidelines and was sometimes deceptive or misleading in describing its own data collection, and that the FISA court, by its nature, there's now discussion of whether this is sufficiently independent and rigorous review that subjects requests to the right amount of scrutiny. So I think that whatever one feels about the disclosures, it's set off a debate, which is what we in the press feel is our job, to stimulate a discussion about how citizens' rights are being protected and whether the government, in a legitimate intelligence collection exercise, has overstepped. And I think that that has been something that has been a continual source of fascination. As Joel pointed out, those who did not have access to classified data, most Americans, and in fact many members of Congress who were not briefed to the level of the Intelligence Committee, did not fully understand the scope of the data collection. But I also think there's a legitimate question of what is the contemporary right and expectation to privacy. And I think that's been another interesting discussion, because you've had the, to me, kind of fascinating spectacle of companies, from Google to Facebook to AOL to Yahoo to Microsoft, whose own business models depend on tracking, collecting, assembling, disseminating data, being compelled under law to provide data to the government, but also have the government piggyback on institutions like tracking and cookies that they themselves have invented. So it's a very interesting question of how do commercial companies now protect the data of their consumers, what lines they draw. And I think so, in addition to the government being held to account, we also have a new spotlight on private companies that Americans entrust, enormous, unprecedented amounts of personal data. So it spilled over from that sphere into the commercial sphere. I think that I really don't want to talk too long, because I'd like to maximize the time for questions, but I did want to try to outline some of the, I think, productive consequences. As Joel pointed out, there are arguably a number of consequences. Anytime these leaks or disclosures take place, there's a lot of debate about the consequences. I was very directly, much more directly than the NSA, which was very closely held at the Times. I mean, even though I'm very senior there, I actually was not informed about it until the article was published, because it was very, very closely held there, and understandably so. But I was very directly involved in the WikiLeaks disclosures, and there I want to say that the Times has always tried to handle these in a very, to our view, responsible and thoughtful manner. When we had the WikiLeaks documents, we spent a great deal of time actually redacting names of Afghans or Iraqis who were named so that they would not suffer consequences, which is something that Julian Assange's group did not do. But in terms of the spying on other countries, I think Joel has made an interesting point about the fact that, this is a game that countries undertake with each other. And when it is brought to the light of day, you have the kind of, in some ways, hypocritical spectacle of people saying they're shocked to find out that gambling is going on in this establishment. So, as I say, this affair has, I think, raised a number of questions at a number of fronts that, at least I would argue, have, in my view, justified the decision that the Times took to participate in their publication.
Susan, thank you very much for those insights and the perspective from the field of journalism into this very, very interesting topic. And we'll get back to you, I think, pretty quickly. Our last panelist this evening is a very distinguished diplomat and author, Ambassador Chaz Freeman. He broke the string here in that he actually did his undergraduate work down the road at Yale, I also spent some time in Mexico and Taiwan, and then, but then he did come back and got his JD at Harvard. So I think we have pretty much a hat trick here on the podium. Chaz was our ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia during the time of Desert Storm, and did a remarkable job in very, very challenging circumstances that ended up, I think, with great success. He began his long and distinguished diplomatic career in India, and then achieved quite a bit of fame as the official translator for the Nixon Initiative to China in 1972. And he's had a lengthy interaction with China, Chinese people, and the government ever since then. Fascinating story. He was our deputy chief of mission, both in Beijing and in Bangkok. It's pretty much the central diplomatic post in the Far East. And he was our assistant secretary of state for African affairs back in Washington, Department of State. Then he jumped across the river and was the assistant secretary of defense for international security affairs in the Pentagon for a couple of very interesting years in the transition out of the Cold War and the, shall we say, remake of NATO into an organization to look outward and deal with current events rather than the Cold War. So Chaz has had a very, very lengthy career, published a lot, highly sought for his opinions, and he's not usually very shy, so I would expect Chaz will be very forthright with us. Chaz, welcome.
Thank you, Fox. It's great to be here. Before I launch into a presentation, I want to just sort of describe where I'm coming from. For 30 years, I was a consumer of intelligence as well as a producer of it. I was also a victim of it. Every bedroom that I ever stayed in had cameras in the walls and microphones as well. And everywhere I went in the course of my professional career as a diplomat, my personal effects were searched. The clumsiest such search actually took place in Honolulu, and the second clumsiest was here in Cambridge. But in any event, I have a strong view that ordinary Americans or people not associated with government officialdom should not have to live their lives in the goldfish bowl that I did. We live in what NSA has called the golden age of signals intelligence, or SIGINT. We might have guessed this, but we now know it for a fact because of a spectacular act of civil disobedience by Edward Snowden. His is perhaps the most consequential such act for both our domestic liberties and our foreign policies, our foreign relations, in the more than 2 centuries of our republic's history. This past spring, Mr. Snowden decided to place his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and his allegiance to the Bill of Rights above his contractual obligations to the intelligence community and the government for which it snoops. He blew the whistle on NSA's ruthless drive for digital omniscience. And when he did this, he knew that many of his fellow citizens would impugn his patriotism. He also knew he would be prosecuted for violating the growing maze of legislation that criminalizes revelations about the national security practices of America's post-9/11 warfare state. Mr. Snowden does not dispute that he is guilty of legally criminal acts, but he places himself in the long line of Americans convinced, as Martin Luther King put it, that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. As someone long in service to our country, I am upset by such defiance of authority. But as an American, I am not. Like Henry David Thoreau and many others in protest movements in our country over the past century and a half, Mr. Snowden deliberately broke the law to bring to public attention government behavior he considered at odds with the U.S. Constitution, American values, and the rule of law. One point he wanted to make was that we Americans now live under a government that precludes legal or political challenges to its own increasingly deviant behavior. Our government has criminalized the release of information exposing such behavior or revealing the policies that authorize it. The only way to challenge its activities and policies is to break the law by exposing them. Mr. Snowden justifies his flight abroad on the grounds that had he remained within the jurisdiction of the United States, he could not have had a fair trial, would very likely have been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and would have been isolated and silenced to avert informed debate by Americans about the public policy issues his revelations raise. Not so very long ago, let's say in the time of Daniel Ellsberg, it would have been fairly easy to show that such fears were groundless. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. Mr. Snowden has been driven to ground in Russia, a country with an incomparably worse record of lawlessness than ours, that he never intended to visit, let alone reside in. If he tries to go elsewhere, he will be hunted down and made to disappear. Post 9/11, practices not seen in our political culture since the abolition of the Starr Chamber by the Habeas Corpus Act of 1640 have again become commonplace. Such practices include, but are not limited to, detention without charge or trial, various forms of physical and psychological abuse, and the extrajudicial murder of American citizens on the order of the president. All of these are facilitated by electronic eavesdropping, as is state terrorism by drones and death squads. Like the inhabitants of countries we condemn for gross violations of human rights, Americans are now subject to warrantless surveillance of our electronic interactions with each other, the arbitrary seizure at the border of our computers and private correspondence, the use of torture and degrading practices in interrogation and pretrial detention, and prosecution upon evidence we cannot see or challenge because it is classified. In the 13 years since the 21st century began, many of the rights that once defined our republic have been progressively revoked, in particular those enumerated in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments to our Constitution. The freedoms that have been curtailed include the rights to immunity from searches and seizures, except, and I quote, upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized, unquote. The right not to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The right to a speedy and public trial and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. Mr. Snowden has brought home to us that while we Americans do not yet live in a police state or tyranny, we are well along in building the infrastructure on which either could be instantly erected if our leaders decided to do so. No longer protected by the law, our freedoms now depend on the self-restraint and goodwill of men and women in authority, many of them in uniform. History protests that if one builds a turnkey totalitarian state, those who hold the keys will sooner or later turn them. One does not have to approve of Mr. Snowden's conduct to recognize the service he's done us by exposing the cancerous growth of our government surveillance apparatus. The issues before us, I think, are neither his character nor the punishment he should receive. The issues we must address are, first, how much domestic surveillance can be reconciled with the Constitution and the immunities from government intrusion it once guaranteed to individuals and groups. And second, and here I agree, of course, with Susan in bringing in the private sector's intrusions into those immunities as well. And second, where and against which foreigners and to what extent such electronic snooping should be carried out abroad. The United States was founded on the principle that government is best that governs least. The concept of limited government is wholly incompatible with the notion of an omniscient executive, still less one that is protected by secrecy from both accountability and the checks and balances imposed by independent judicial review, congressional and public oversight, or even common sense. Yet we can no longer be in any doubt that our fear of foreign and domestic terrorism has caused us to nurture just such a governmental leviathan. Judicial checks on surveillance activities by an essentially co-opted FISA court have been both minimal and ineffectual. NSA has in fact not always heeded these rulings in any case. There is no evidence of congressional pushback against the steady expansion of snooping on Americans or foreigners, or of presidential efforts to restrain either. The very members of Congress responsible for intelligence community oversight professed to be shocked when they learned about the scope of NSA's eavesdropping on both Americans and foreign leaders. The president claimed ignorance. Whether these political postures reflect dishonesty or incompetence is unclear. What is not in doubt is that there has been a massive ongoing failure by our government to conduct its intelligence activities in a manner supportive of our liberties and our alliances with foreign nations. Both oversight and management of intelligence collection programs need urgent corrective surgery. And it is time for a major pruning of the jungle of surveillance programs that national hysteria about terrorism, essentially limitless funding, and the burgeoning technical capabilities of our modern age have combined to produce. The very purpose of the state is the management of the nation's defense. To do this, the authorities must have situational awareness and early warning of possible threats from both state and non-state actors. SIGINT, like other forms of espionage and diplomatic reporting and analysis, is certainly part of the answer to this need. But SIGINT was invented to support actions on the battlefield. For the most part, it remains a military project. We should not ask our military to exercise restraint when attacking perceived threats. Armies are not expected to play by the rules, but to win. They are inevitably inclined to overkill. It's been said that an elephant is a mouse built to military specifications. True to the military culture of excess from which it sprang, NSA is an intrusive collection apparatus that has evolved to, quote, collect it all, unquote. All is much too much. Given their invisibility, secret programs have a particular propensity to expand beyond their original purposes. The view that activities that are not legal are not necessarily illegal, and that any and all technology should be exploited à l'outrance is what underlies the decision to collect it all. It's hardly surprising that this has become NSA's self-proclaimed mission. Why does a chicken cross the road? Why does a dog lick its balls? Because it can. Why does NSA snoop on everyone, everywhere online? Because it has the money and the means to do so, not because what it collects meets any valid, externally determined national requirement, standard of efficiency, or foreign policy judgment. The fact that we're able to do things that violate the trust and privacy of others does not make it wise or appropriate to do them. What we've seen since 9/11 is a combination of adaptation to new international circumstances and a growing ration of purposeless program growth, only tangentially related to threats to our national security. In the case of SIGINT, this is a dangerous misdirection of resources. Conventional threats of all kinds are now minimal, but cyber threats are escalating. SIGINT capabilities should be focused on potential enemies and on defending citizens and their government against foreign cyber intrusions, theft, and sabotage, not on collecting information about citizens in the United States or other democracies. It is neither necessary nor proper to spy on democratic foreign allies who do not spy on us. It is not necessary because these allies are open societies that debate their basic policies in public, and we are represented in their capitals by diplomatic missions whose purpose, in part, is to keep our government informed about their motivations, reasoning, plans, and operations. If we need to understand these societies and their capabilities better, we should strengthen our diplomacy, not our covert military trespasses against them. Mr. Snowden documented misbehavior that was a Pandora's box of embarrassments waiting to burst open. It should have been seen as such by those who authorized and carried it out. Their overreach has now done great damage to our moral standing internationally. This is a painful reminder that eavesdropping on allies is no more compatible with a mutually respectful and cooperative relationship than behaving like a peeping Tom is with friendship. By alienating our foreign admirers and supporters, we've weakened our country's political influence abroad. By hacking into our great information technology companies to create Trojan horses, our government has spread distrust of U.S. products and services and damaged the competitiveness of our economy. By belying the decent respect for the opinions of mankind with which we inaugurated our nation, Washington has catalyzed a global loss of confidence in the righteousness of American leadership. By showing suspicious contempt for allies and ready hostility toward other nations, Americans have undermined the prospects for future international cooperation with allies and on our armed forces, as well as peaceful coexistence with our competitors. In the Cold War, we Americans and our allies justly saw ourselves as threatened with nuclear annihilation or ideological subjugation. Someone in Moscow could turn a key, and most of us would soon be dead. The threats before us are in no way comparable, yet in the face of a diminished danger, our leaders have chosen, mostly in secret, to defend our freedoms and preserve our international standing in ways that diminish both. Our own government has become a vastly more potent threat to the traditions and civil liberties of our republic and to the rule of law than Al-Qaeda ever could hope to be. Our ability to intercept, decipher, and understand the communications of those who wish us ill is an invaluable competency. But it is a capability, as Joel said, that coexists uneasily with a free society, as well as with cooperation with other free societies. Those who exercise it are, for the most part, patriots attempting to defend our nation, not infringe on its liberties. But our misapplication of their ability to eavesdrop on their fellow citizens, as well as democratic allies who do not spy on us, is a perversion of its purpose that must be curtailed. The collection of intelligence is essential to our national security. It is not and cannot be an end in itself. And in a democracy, it cannot be safely conducted without judgment based on a sense of propriety and self-restraint born of deference to the rule of law. Freedom requires checks and balances, not paternalistic monitoring by the government. It is now incontrovertible that we have failed to apply effective checks and balances to core national security and intelligence functions. No one in Washington or anywhere else should be in a position to turn a key and deprive us or our posterity of the blessings of liberty. It's past time to rethink and radically downsize both the warfare state and the undisciplined surveillance apparatus it has given birth to. Thank you.
Before I propose a couple of questions for the panel, I'd like to just make a couple of comments on my own behalf regarding some of the discussion here and maybe provide another perspective. First of all, I also spent many decades living in the international fishbowl that Chaz described. most memorable occasion was being rudely awakened in the middle of the night by a resetting tape recorder that malfunctioned and kept whacking around in the ventilating system of my hotel room. But so I've been a part of that. I've also been on the downside of the release of previously classified information that I thought was extremely damaging to our ability to actually conduct diplomacy and engagement in the world. To wit, many of the WikiLeaks cables featured my name and my dialogue with leaders around the world. And those conversations were conducted in an atmosphere of those present in the room, to be held in the highest confidence, and in many cases that was severely undone by many of the revelations, much of which had, I think, little in the way of understanding, I would think, of our average people in the impact this had on the willingness of foreign leaders to actually engage us in a conversation under any circumstances in the future. So the other comment I'd make before we set off on a march to Fort Meade to burn down NSA, I will tell you that as a wartime commander, given a responsibility for the lives and well-being of hundreds of thousands of our people in uniform, that I was the recipient of a tremendous amount of very, very valuable information and intelligence from the NSA that we were able to use to save countless lives, not only of our own people, but of people in other countries. So we clearly have a challenge in policy and in execution, but there are many, many thousands of people out there who work for these agencies that are actually trying their utmost to do the right thing and to do things that will be helpful to us as citizens in the country. So let me end there and make a comment that a lot of water's gone over the dam and a lot of milk's been spilled in these recent scandals, and not much we're going to do to change the history. But as we look forward to the future, what is it I would ask the panel to comment on? What would you see as priority tasks to end up putting in balance the need for intelligence, the need for security, and the having in mind the expectations of rights of the average citizen? Any of those folks among us who serve in governments give up a part of this privacy just by the nature of the business? And anybody in the room that thinks for a minute that the advent of these nifty little devices has in any way helped your personal security, I think you're dreaming a dream. And so, I tend to be kind of pragmatic, so I get a lot of advantage of it, and I know there's a price to pay, and it isn't the $399 it costs for the gadget. It's, what would you like to know? I'm sure some people have access to it. So, panelists, we look to the future. What should we be focusing on? What could be done? What should be done? Care to share? Joel, you want to kick it off since it's been a while since we've heard from you?
Yes, I've been listening carefully. Look, we have a massive overcollection problem, overclassification problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's very difficult, will be difficult to get our hands on. It's because it's so understandable that people in the system will overclassify it to protect themselves, not for any malicious or evil intent. And we ought to be assembling a serious commission on how to do that. I do agree with Chaz about winding down the war state and the intelligence apparatus that it has engendered, although there are other aspects of what you said I hope to have time to come back to address. I believe we will have some significant but not radical changes in the way the FISA court operates. I don't really think either of you characterized it correctly. It is not a rubber stamp. It tends to kick back something on the order of a quarter of the applications that are made to it. Nobody, and it'd be interesting for the Times to do this, to compare that to the record of denials that come to Title III warrants. Nobody's done this. And if you do it, I believe you will see that the court, as I know from being inside, is very tough. The problem is, even when the court has found the agency, and nobody's found that it's intentionally misled the court, but it has screwed up royally a couple of times, the court's in the position of, it knows that lots of this collection is really important. And so it's not going to say, because it's angry at a misstatement, stop collecting. It can't do that. But the court ought not to be able to make the equivalent of policy changes or major interpretations of law without an outside advocate. And there ought to be much more, there has been and will continue to be much more released to the public about the nature of the court's work. We are in a position where we have to create trusted mechanisms by which secrets can be kept. The public is never going to be let into the details of these court orders. Impossible. So the question is, how do you set up a mechanism that will increase public trust? And this is, I think, an urgent thing to do. Let me talk about civil disobedience for just a minute. Oh, by the way, Susan, the papers have not well reported this, but not only were, of course, everybody knows the intelligence committees were well briefed on this, but the Justice Department, not NSA, but the Justice Department made an offer to all 535 members of Congress to brief them on how the law was being interpreted. And almost nobody outside the committees accepted this offer. We've got a Tuesday to Thursday Congress. It is just the canard has got out that the rest of the Congress didn't know what they were approving. It's silly. It's just silly. But let me talk about civil disobedience for a minute. When Thoreau engaged in civil disobedience, he went to jail. When Emerson came to visit Thoreau, I guess in the Middlesex County lockup, Thoreau says to him, and Emerson says, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" He says, "Emerson, what are you doing out there?" When Gandhi led the Salt March in South Africa, he stood the legal consequences of his civil disobedience. When Martin Luther King engaged in civil disobedience, he stood the legal consequences of it. For the same reason that civil disobedient theorists, going back to Socrates, had understood that if you were going to be engaged in civil disobedience as a citizen, in order to discredit the laws you do not approve of, you must stand the consequences, especially in a democracy. Otherwise, you are just a criminal or a rebel. Chaz, when Martin Luther King wrote his letter, he wrote it from the Birmingham jail, not from a hotel room in Hong Kong or the Moscow airport. He's a criminal and a rebel. That doesn't mean he hasn't kicked off a useful public discussion. You also, I think, ought to address in the course of your articulate and passionate remarks the scope of what the man decided to release. Much of what he released had nothing to do with the civil rights of Americans or of other people in other democracies. One of the difficulties, so I don't agree with you about the civil disobedience. One of the problems we've got now in dealing with terrorism, and I do agree with you that the notion that we must do everything to stop, we must take zero risk with terrorism, which is Dick Cheney's thought. Taking zero risk with terrorism or zero risk with crime is virtually a definition of a police state. We cannot do it. We don't want to do it. But it's very difficult for people in office, and it's especially has been difficult for this president, given who he followed, to accept the risk. Now, when the objects of our surveillance were foreign governments, they were few, and we knew who they were. The difficulty now is that the intelligence agencies are being tasked by their civilian overlords with finding terrorists they don't yet know about. We don't have civil right problems or human right issues with collecting against people we do know about, with people we know are terrorists or we know are enemies. The problem is finding terrorists before they blow stuff up and unrolling their networks. That is the task. Now, I think we have to recognize that in spite of even if we agree that we've decided that the notion of zero risk is an appalling idea, But the public, when asked, do we want the FBI or the NSA to be engaged in this? They want this. We do not want more of what happened in Boston last year at the marathon. Not that NSA could have prevented that one. But that's the kind of problem that makes this so difficult. It's not just collecting against standard conventional military targets anymore. That world is gone. It was easier to live in it, and it was certainly easier from the point of view of civil liberties and so on. But it is a different world we're in now, and it's ever so much more complex, I think, than you represented it.
Let me turn to Susan Chira, but I can't resist throwing in one technical tidbit, and that is that in my experience, the sense that we're vacuuming up everything is not anything new, and I believe that it stems from a challenge that has been around for as long as certainly I've been, not that old, but I've been around a few years. And that is that in a technical sense, the intelligence that we would like to get out of the information is so difficult to extract that we often, and I've watched this now for many decades with systems far more antique than the current ones, collect vast volumes. Most of it ends up being just tossed aside because we haven't figured out how to crack the knuckle. So there's not much new. Susan, journalism, what do you think?
I mean, very briefly, because as a journalist, on the news side, it's not my role to, take public stances. But I would say, as a journalist, it seems to me the history has proven over and over again that transparency leads to accountability, and that what we have seen here, at least from the perspective of a journalist who has been in on conversations where people have argued not to publish, that when you publish, accountability follows, and that overclassification, as Joel mentioned, is a huge issue. I mean, a number of documents that are classified have absolutely no reason other than protecting someone to be classified, and that, trusting institutions to police themselves has historically not worked. I think history has proven that. And so that, I believe not only in my own self-interest, but as an American citizen, that greater transparency, understanding that there's a need for intelligence collection, and greater accountability prevent abuses. That's it.
Chaz, if I could ask you for about a minute here.
Yeah, very briefly, because I'm looking at a very patient gentleman standing at the mic. I wouldn't claim that, and I didn't say that Edward Snowden is a perfect exemplar of civil disobedience, but I don't think Emerson would be interviewing him in the jail if he were if he were locked up here. And I don't think he'd be writing any letters out of the jail. So he had a reason for doing what he did. It's too bad he did it. I agree. But anyway, that's that. I agree with you, Joel, on the tremendous amount of overclassification, but I also agree with Fox on the damage WikiLeaks did, which was like publishing every lawyer-client conversation that you could imagine out there. Tremendous violations of confidence, huge damage to the standing of our military and civilian representatives abroad. The question Fox asked was, what could be done? And Joel started answering some of that. There needs to be an adversarial process built into the FISA system. There needs to be a public advocate. There needs to be an advocate of the rights of those whose rights may be infringed by proposed actions. Clearly, congressional oversight sucks. And we need to insist that those Congress critters that we put down there in Washington, where I have the misfortune to live, that they actually do their jobs. And I think I agree with Joel very much that with those allies who are not spying on us, and there are some such,
Not many.
Depends. You know, we need to have some kind of equivalent of arms control, a mutual stand down to maintain the trust and confidence that it's essential to make alliances work. I don't think anybody argues that that would apply to Russia or China or others, maybe Brazil, others who are clear competitors. But there needs to be a rule of reason, common sense, and some sense of propriety brought to bear on the management of relationships internationally, which suggests to me a final point that somehow or other some element of diplomatic judgment needs to be brought into this sphere. It is now compartmentalized and largely excluded from that sort of foreign policy judgment. And that's how we get the kind of embarrassment that we now face.
Yeah, we agree about that.
All right, well, thanks very much. Now, the rules again, no speeches, no manifestos. You got a question, please ask it or we'll move on. This gentleman has been long-standing. Sir.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Admiral Fallon, for your service to our country. I thanked you privately, but I'd like to thank you publicly. We're very grateful. Thanks to the panel. We appreciate your sincerity. Thank you for coming. You know, I guess if I have to focus on my question, what I'm concerned about is they're building and I only hear things and read things. I don't claim to know anything, but they're building this labyrinthine Leviathan out in Utah, this superplex, NASA superplex, NSA superplex out in Utah. But it's come to my attention, and I don't know if it's true or not, but the NSA was spying on the terrorists at the Papal Conclave, the College of Cardinals, when they were selecting a new pope, Pope Francis. The question is, I think it just doesn't smell right, and it's very inappropriate, given the fact that the NSA and the CIA recruits heavily off of Brigham Young University. That's their most fertile recruiting ground. The Mormon Church is in...
Question.
Okay.
Is there a question? Is the question what goes on in Utah in that big building?
Well, the Mormon Church has global aspirations, claims to be the true church.
Okay, thanks very much. Mary, question. Thanks very much.
I'd like to follow up on Susan's point about transparency, and I would by directing a question first to you, Mr. Brenner. If I were a diligent journalist or citizen, and I read and studied the legislation that Congress passed that applies to NSA's authority and the government's authority, and if I assume the government used that authority to its fullest extent, would I be surprised by anything that I've read in terms of the extent of the government's collection and spying?
Yes, that's why I said the government should have initiated a public debate on this point, precisely because of what you said. I do not think an ordinary, intelligent, well-informed citizen could have read, or a congressman, could have read that statute and understood the manner in which this stuff is really hard to understand, even for those of us who've been in the trenches and dealing with it. It's really, really hard to keep in your head. And the legal authorities are also very complex, perhaps too much so. Anyway, the answer is no, and that's why we should have had a public debate.
Okay, sir.
Hi. Thank you all for this interesting discussion. I have one quick comment and then a question. If we're going to try to compare Edward Snowden to Martin Luther King, we should remember that Martin Luther King was, in fact, assassinated. And he also spent 11 days in jail total. But to my question, and this is for Ambassador Freeman. You spoke of turning our efforts to cybersecurity, but it's the NSA and the same collection apparatus that has overrun its mission in terms of collection that's tasked with cybersecurity. How do we guard against them simply relabeling everything they're doing as cybersecurity efforts and just simply doing it under that rubric?
Well, I would say that I accept the fact that the people who are working at NSA, as several people said, I guess Fox Fallon said it, are serious people interested in doing their jobs, and they're not in there for a malevolent purpose, and they're also subject to discipline. So the question is, are the disciplines and the policy guidance correct? Are the programs correctly designed? Are they monitored and kept within the bounds that they are meant to be kept within? And here, there does need to be outside monitoring and a check. It cannot be done inside the NSA. And I'm not sure exactly what the answer is to how we do this in a manner consistent with preserving the secrecy of sources and methods to the extent we need to. But it's a subject we really need to get working on.
I think we ought to separate two distinct issues. The oversight mechanisms look at whether that agency or any other agency has broken the law. The main issue that's on the table now is a political one.
Right.
And you won't get an oversight agency dealing. This is political judgment, and as you were saying, we ought to have political and diplomatic judgment. I agree with that. But the oversight mechanisms, I gotta say, really work well. Now, that will strike you as jaw-dropping because you don't like the law that they were operating under. But we have different levels of oversight, and we say, okay, congressional oversight sucks. Yes and no. I mean, I don't think it's very effective either. But this leads to what I call the oversight paradox. The farther away from the agency the overseer is, the more credibility it has with the public, and the less likelihood it knows SIGINT from Shinola. You look at the Inspector General's office, which has been extremely tough on violations that it's found at the agency, extremely tough. But neither of those deal with the issue that I think is in the forefront of the minds of the people here in this room, which is political.
Okay, I just want to make a very quick comment. I find it deeply disturbing that Senator Feinstein was not agitated about eavesdropping on Americans, but became extremely upset about Angela Merkel's privacy. First of all, Angela Merkel has to be really stupid if she thought, if it wasn't the Americans listening to her, it was everybody else in the world doing so. So why on earth was she following procedures that facilitated this kind of invasion of her privacy? That wasn't smart. But I think she's a foreign leader. She is a legitimate target for information collection in a sense that no one in this room is, if you're an American citizen. And Dianne Feinstein should have been concerned long before she heard of Angela Merkel's problems.
So there's some pretty high levels of hypocrisy that would be the
one
summation. Sir, quick one.
One quick rejoin.
Next, please. Please. We're out of time. We'll get a couple more.
Okay. If the New York Times is so concerned about American citizens' rights and privacy under FISA and the national security state, then why didn't it follow up in September on the disclosure that the NSA was passing raw, unfiltered data collected surreptitiously on Americans to Israel and its intelligence agencies? Dean Baquet said that that was not an important story, but I think it's pretty important, don't you, that when the American government is passing private information about its own citizens to another foreign government, especially an unscrupulous rogue government like Israel?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question, but I believe you're referring to an article that appeared in another publication, and I'm forgetting which one now. I work very closely with Dean Baquet. I don't believe he said it wasn't a story. I believe what he said was that the issue of cooperation between the NSA and other allied governments was not exactly a shocking disclosure to people who have followed intelligence collection, and it has been discussed publicly before. So thank you for your question.
The specific allegation in that case was that whereas we redact information passed to the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, we were not doing so in the case of Israel, and that the part of the monitoring process here would lend itself to Israeli examination of who was anti-Israel and saying things that it regarded as
refreshing my memory on
objection.
that, and I appreciate that. I really don't, I don't have access to that quote, but I don't think that Dean thought it wasn't a story. I think it was published by another publication that had access to some data that we did not have access to, but I appreciate your bringing it up.
Question.
This question is for Mr. Brenner and Ambassador Freeman, if he wishes to comment. If I'm not mistaken, Snowden has been or will be charged with treason. That does not allow him very many options in the form of a defense. He cannot defend himself as a whistleblower, for instance. Given that, what sort of due process could we really expect for Snowden? And might that explain why he does not return to the United States? I'm confident he would if he were convinced that he could get a free, open trial, as afforded every American by the Constitution of the United States. Thanks.
I don't know why you think, I don't know why anybody thinks that the rights of any defendant in a criminal case in a federal court in the United States don't apply to Edward Snowden.
I think the analogy is drawn commonly, Joel, to the Manning case and the treatment that he received in a very different context because he was a serving enlisted man in the military. But when you have the judge in that case declaring that he had been subjected to cruel and unusual treatment, the question arises, given the hysteria over Mr. Snowden, was it unreasonable for him to think that that this question was unrealistic? I don't know the answer to your question, but I suspect in many things, perception is reality. In this case, Mr. Snowden's perception was clearly that he couldn't get a fair trial.
Look, I don't want, because I served in the government in that agency, to have anything to do with the way Bradley, or had anything to do or would defend the way Bradley Manning was treated. But Edward Snowden was a civilian. There would be no pretext for putting him in front of a military tribunal. If he came back, he'd be facing the possibility of onerous imprisonment, no doubt. And sure, he might decide he didn't want to do that. He'd go live somewhere else. But I think it's not true to suggest that he would be treated differently in terms of the rights afforded to him than anybody else in a federal district court.
Got time for one more, and gentlemen, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to do this.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question.
No comments. Question, please.
All right. Well, you can find a logo for a recent NSA satellite program on the internet with Google Images. It shows a giant octopus encircling the entire world. And the caption is, nothing escapes us. The question is, when NSA does online surveillance in online communities such as Second Life or World of Warcraft, do you think how or if they tell the difference between the avatars of American citizens and foreign nationals? Also, is the NSA subject to the Freedom of Information Act?
Want to take the last one?
Well, I mean, you might be able to answer better than I, Joel, about, I mean, I know, I read very carefully our story on the World of Warcraft ventures of the NSA, but I do not know, because I did not have access to the documents, if your first question was addressed. And in terms of the Freedom of Information Act, yes, it's subject.
Yes, but classified information is not subject to FOIA.
Right. So we can't FOIA classified information. You know, FOIA being the shorthand for
Freedom of Information Act.
Well, if 10 million people who thought maybe their rights had been violated all filed FOIA requests, do you think NSA would comply? And might they learn something in the process of
They don't write the rules for FOIA.
No, the FOIA rules just exempt classified information. It's a classified program. I think there are real issues as to whether, should they have been doing it, whether it did any good or not. I only know what I read in the papers. I went out too long to have any inside information. I can tell you that, back in 2005, 6, 7, in that era, there was a lot of thought being given to the ability to use that kind of environment, that kind of cyber environment for both not only crime but also espionage and counter-espionage. That was not a foolish thing to think. I do not have any first-hand knowledge of how it was used. I only know now what I read in the papers, which doesn't sound like it was a very useful program.
It is an illustration of a point that Joel made earlier, which I think bears repetition, and that is in an era of globalization in which communication is universal across national boundaries, it is extraordinarily difficult to draw the sorts of distinctions that might be desirable.
Well, look, it's been delightful to be able to bring this group together and to have such high interest levels from the audience. It's a lot of very, very complex issues that are underneath this Snowden affair umbrella, as you can see, and certainly not going to be sorted out by the brilliant panelists we have here today. My big takeaway is there's a tremendous amount of real work that has to go on in Washington, among other places, in terms of shaping realistic, effective, and useful policies that will, as governments always have to do, balance many interests. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank CIS for putting this on. Thank you.